everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Next week, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization, or APEC, will hold its leaders' meeting in San Francisco. Leaders from 21 APEC members will gather, and though the forum is operated on the basis of non-binding commitments, it will serve as a chance for members to promote regional economic integration. The highlight of this year would, of course, be a bilateral summit between U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping, though Xi is yet to confirm his attendance. What are they expected to discuss, and what would the summit mean for South Korea? For this, we invited Professor Lim Eun-jung from Kongju National University. Welcome, Professor Lim.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening. And we also have Professor Robert Kelly from Pusan National University. Good to see you, Professor Kelly.
Hi, thank you for having me again.
Hi, thank you for being with us. Now, first question to our Professor Im. Let's first tap into the background of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. For what purpose has this intergovernmental forum been established?
Well, APEC is a bit different from probably other international organizations because its aim is more generally for economic exchange or prosperity of the Asia-Pacific region with the longer-term vision of creating an Asian-Pacific community someday. It was again founded in November 1989 with the 12 founding members, including South Korea. The meeting was held in Canberra, Australia. And now, as you just explained, the members are 21. But interestingly, again, the APEC members are economy, not actually sovereign states. So they're not actually permitted to use the name country or fly the national flag. So thus, Taiwan or Hong Kong are referred to as the Chinese Taipei quotation mark and Hong Kong, China, respectively. Meeting between the APEC leaders are therefore called APEC economic leaders meetings, not the summits, and decisions are made by consensus and are it's not binding, as you just explained to, and emphasizing more like a voluntary participation or implementation by member economies.
All right, thank you for your explanation, Professor Im. Now, Professor Kelly, I'd like to ask you about the role it can play. The Asia-Pacific region has been actively pursuing new regional cooperation frameworks recently, including the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. As far as I know, RCEP excludes the U.S., while IPEF excludes China. And as a forum that includes both of the countries, in what ways could APEC be used to mitigate conflicts and promote free trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific region?
Yeah, actually, I think you really put your finger on it right there, right? It's one of the only bodies for the region that includes China and the United States, and that's really valuable strategically. I mean, it's really good for trade too, right? U.S. and China trade a great deal. Of course, they're kind of the primary trading relationship of the world economy, but it's also strategically pretty important, which is to say that the U.S. and China aren't actually interacting that much. Right. We know that Xi hasn't agreed yet, for example, to come to APEC. There haven't been a lot of sort of high-level meetings between the U.S. and China. There's been a real falling out over things like the South China Sea and the Ukraine war. And so this is actually a really good way to get elites in the region talking to each other. There are pretty serious political divisions in East Asia and sort of around the Pacific. And it's really good that you get all these people around the table. And particularly, I think this creates an opportunity for the president of China and the president of the United States to meet without sort of the kind of diplomatic dance of who invited who and, you know, did someone sort of defer to the other by agreeing to some kind of meeting or something like that. You don't have those kinds of issues here. They can both sort of show up and say, you know, this is kind of a part of our normal diplomacy, and then you can have a side meeting. I think the larger issue, though, what APEC is supposed to be about, trade is tricky, right? I mean, you've got a large number of members. They're very culturally diverse, right? APEC reaches from like Chile in South America through, you know, Russia and down to sort of Australia. I mean, there's a huge number of very culturally and economically different countries. And so trying to get them all to agree to some kind of even mildly organized trade framework has been pretty hard, right? APEC's sort of heyday was in the 90s and it's kind of slipped away. And now I think it's sort of come back a little bit because it's a way for China and the U.S. to talk to each other. I think maybe the strategic issues might be outweighing the trade issues.
All right, I see. So APEC can indeed play a strategically important role. I see. Well, Professor Im, now to this year's 30th edition of APEC. The United States is hosting this year's under the theme of creating a resilient and sustainable future for all. What are the key agenda items that are going to be discussed?
Well, first of all, APEC, as Professor Kelly very well explained, is a natural arena or opportunity for both countries, again, the U.S. and China together. And it is, again, the largest regional organization that represents, for example, like 60% of the whole global GDP, or like it covers 40% of the world's population. So it's very extensive, again, the framework that can deal with many different agendas. And having said that, again, this year's theme, as you just mentioned, is creating a resilient and sustainable future for all. So I think they are trying to, again, emphasize the importance of this specific framework, which is pretty much extensive. And open regionalism is a content principle that is unique to the APEC, I think, and it reflects the organization commitment to treating non-regional members as well, pretty much equally with the regional economies in the trade and investment, thereby avoiding any of those, kind of exclusiveness. So the procedure principle is also based on the consensus, as I explained earlier, so which emphasizes the importance of members, harmonious, again, the decision making in all process, and the pursuit of the joint action and the reconciliation of the differences in a gradual or voluntary rather than a coercive manner. So this time, again, this year, U.S. is the host, and they provided the 3 keywords for the upcoming APEC meeting. 1 is interconnected, and 2 is innovative, and 3 is inclusive. So having provided the 3 I's, again, I think the U.S. is trying to get all these member economies together to think about more like a global issues in an innovative and more inclusive way.
All right, I see your point, Professor Im. Now, Professor Kelly, something that definitely needs to be looked at is, of course, Biden-Xi summit. And the summit would be the first one since November last year in Bali, Indonesia, on the sidelines of the G20. What was discussed then, and how have bilateral ties been up until now?
Yeah, well, I think things have gotten worse, to be perfectly honest, right? Which is to say that the Ukraine war has sort of gone on and on. And I think that is probably the biggest strategic issue in the world right now, right? Because it sort of looks like it's pitting NATO against Russia with sort of Chinese backing behind the Russians, and it sort of has this kind of, sort of Cold War kind of feel to it. And the war has dragged on, right? I think there was sort of hope in the West that maybe the Ukrainians might win some kind of lightning victory this year. We gave them all this assistance and stuff like that. There's supposed to be some breakthrough over the summer. It didn't happen, right? And so as long as that war continues, it's going to be hard for the United States and China to close strategic distance on other similar, analogous strategic issues, and was obviously Taiwan and the South China Sea. And so I think those are the kinds of issues that really the two sides are going to talk about, which is, again, it's kind of ironic because actually that's not really what an APEC is supposed to be, right? APEC is supposed to be like regional trade and open regionalism, as Dr. Lim was saying, and that's actually not really what I think everybody is looking at next week, right? It's actually more about, can the Americans and the Chinese get along, right? Can they keep the economic engine between the two of them moving, or will the strategic issues that are dividing them, sort of pull apart this integration, right? And there's already a lot of pressure in the United States for decoupling, right? It's sort of the hot term in the business community is de-risking, right? Which means sort of like bringing production chains out of China, moving to safer places, moving back to North America, or moving to Southeast Asia or India or something like that, to sort of get away from the kind of political caprice of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that's all the kind of stuff that's on the table, right? I mean, can the Americans and the Chinese keep talking, right? And I think on the side, there are some things that they could actually sort of really work on. North Korea, for example, is an obvious one. Climate change is an obvious one. Trade rules, some kind of rules of the road, some kind of like framework for maritime disagreements in the South China Sea, where I think there's a real potential actually for, like the U.S. and China to actually literally like have their ships collide and lead to some kind of incident. My guess is those are the issues that are going to be on the agenda next week. I think the U.S.-China bilateral trade relationship is really managed bilaterally rather than channeled through APEC.
All right, I see. So the bilateral ties has been quite worse, but now it seems that they are trying to improve their ties as they, in principle, agreed to hold a summit, right? But Professor Lim, the White House confirmed President Biden's plans to meet Chinese President Xi Jinping, yet China is yet to announce Xi's visit to San Francisco. What could be the reason behind this?
Well, certainly the Beijing's response sounds a little subtler, more subtle than the Washington. It seems like, again, according to the Chinese media, they keep emphasizing the Chinese so-called demands, including like addressing security and economic sanctions concerns, while major U.S. media have suggested that the two countries are pretty much likely, as you just mentioned, pretty much likely to cooperate on a range of advanced the dialogue. So we certainly see a kind of temperature gap or perception gap between the Beijing and Washington. As we just discussed last year at the Bali meeting, they agreed that, again, the two leaders of the two countries, they agreed that, we don't want to repeat the new Cold War. So they agreed on the kind of opposition to the how would you say, those more like a divided world, like a situation, just like during the Cold War. However, still there are certain kind of reality, including all this trade issues or technology competition. Again, all this hegemonic competition between the two is about the future technology. So it is hard to be stopped by the Biden administration. So certainly they do have those of kind of hurdles or like obstacles. So that is why probably Chinese reaction is more like a kind of complicated than the Washington.
All right, I see. So I understand that we are seeing perception gap between China and the U.S. But Professor Kelly, Hong Kong's sanction-hit chief executive John Lee is to skip the APEC forum owing to the scheduling issues. And some say this could have been one of the measures agreed upon by the U.S. and China to make it easier to improve the ties. What's your view on this?
Yeah, Hong Kong's a really, really tricky issue for the Americans, right? Because it's pretty clearly under Chinese sovereignty. It's pretty clear that the Chinese Communist Party, particularly under Xi, has been sort of undercutting the deal that was originally designed to protect various Hong Kong freedoms. But there's just not a lot that we can do about that, right? There's just not a great deal that the outside world can do, right? I mean, we're not going to intervene in Hong Kong, right? I mean, we really are kind of subject to, again, to the caprice of the party. The primary constraint actually on the party's behavior in Hong Kong has been fear of driving out all the financial firms, right? A lot of them Western financial firms, like CalPERS and stuff like that, right? They're in Hong Kong, right? And the more the Chinese sort of crack down, the more those firms are going to run away to Tokyo, to Seoul, to Singapore. And that has slowly been happening, right? On issues on something like Taiwan, it's a lot easier for us to actually do defense aid, right? You can actually send out the Navy. There's a gap of water that can be defended and things like that. But there's very, very little that can be done on Hong Kong. And as a result, my sense is the Americans, this is just something that the Americans are probably not going to fight for too much because there's just not a whole lot that can be done. I mean, the Donald Trump administration basically told Xi Jinping, you can do whatever you want, right? And so I think some of this is just kind of cutting our losses, right? This is sort of looking at like, what can we get the Chinese to actually come around, or we might get the Chinese sort of behave better in the South China Sea. I think that's a really big issue, by the way. And maybe we can get the Chinese to sort of back off a little bit on the rhetoric on Taiwan, but we really have no options. There's really nothing we can do to actually like bail out the Hong Kongers, to really aid them, which is really sort of a shame. But there we are. And so I think, I mean, this is diplomacy, right? I mean, the Biden people have to sort of pick and choose, about what they can get from the Chinese. And this is just something that we're not going to get. So if the Chinese don't come to the meeting, or if the Hong Kongers don't get to come to the meeting because the Chinese government doesn't want them to come, I don't really think the Americans are going to really fight about that. There's so many other issues in the relationship.
Right, I see your point. Now, Professor Im, I'd like to tap on the agendas that could be discussed if the summit does take place between Biden and Xi. One of the major talking points would be whether the U.S. would lift or ease de-risking measures, and if China would do the same, lifting its export bans and so on. What would China want, and what is the possibility of U.S. lifting de-risking measures?
Again, as I mentioned earlier, it seems like Beijing's demands is pretty much clear. Again, when Mr. Wang Yi, the foreign minister, Chinese foreign minister, visited Washington recently, he clearly mentioned that, of course, our goal, quote, again, our goal is to return to bilateral relations to a healthy and stable development trajectory as soon as possible. However, at the same time, he also mentioned the two countries must ensure the return to Bali, again, the Bali norms or Bali principles, which includes like, again, the no regime change, no seeking for regime change in China, or no pursuing Cold War, another new Cold War in this era, or not just pursuing, not supporting the Taiwan's independence, those kind of things. So Chinese principles are pretty much clear, and I think these cannot be that much conflicting with the Biden's foreign policy. However, as I mentioned earlier, this strategic rivalry between the two is all about future technology. Who's gonna be the dominant player in the field of future technology? So, more like a lighter sanctions it can be discussed lifting or not. However, those, the sanctions or like trade regulations related to the future technology like AI or like quantum computing, those kind of things, it might be very much difficult to, lift for the Biden administration. And the election is coming too. So certainly those, technology competition is, I think, a key factor to determine the U.S.'s, again, the foreign policy. So that might be, again, which can make us pretty much skeptical about the result of the bilateral summit, as just Professor Kelly shared his own view.
All right, I see your point. We need to also consider the upcoming election, I see. Well, Professor Kelly, staying on the discussion of export controls, reports say that the U.S. and China could hold rare nuclear arms control talks before the Biden-Xi meeting. Could these talks in any way be part of China's efforts to use them as leverage when discussing export controls and others?
Yeah, I would imagine actually you'll see a Chinese effort at linkage on that, right? I mean, we know the Chinese are starting to modernize their arsenal, which means specifically what that means is they're building more warheads, right? It looks like they're going to try to tap out at somewhere between 1,200 to 1,500. Right now they have something like 600, we think, right? We don't fully know. And they're also building more ICBM silos, which means sort of large land-based missiles. You sort of dig them into the ground. And this is a strategic concern for the United States. The United States is modernizing its own arsenal. In response to this, the Americans are about to spend a great deal of money in the next 25 years modernizing, right? So it looks like we're kind of sliding into a bit of a nuclear arms race, a missile race with the Chinese. And that's not too unexpected. Of course, we did that with the Soviet Union as well during the Cold War. But it would be good if we could control that, right? If we could prevent it. The Chinese and the United States do not currently have an arms control treaty at all. The Chinese do not belong to any of the structures that the Soviets and the Americans built during the Cold War, and the Americans have been talking about this. Has become sort of a bigger and bigger issue in the last 10 years, right? Trying to rope the Chinese into some kind of deal for warhead limitations, throw weight, and things like that. The Chinese have stayed away from that stuff. They've sort of avoided a kind of triangular relationship with us and the Russians to try to come to, agreements on these things. And I think that's probably, as you said, I think this is actually one of the things that the Biden people will probably bring up. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Chinese made an effort at linkage, right? Which is the Chinese are very worried about American market access restrictions. China is still primarily an export-dependent economy. Chinese consumers do not consume enough domestically to support Chinese production, right? If China can't export, its economy shrinks, right? And so they need to export. The biggest market of the Americans, they've got to get market access. The U.S. Congress is turning very much against Chinese market access in the United States. TikTok and all that, we're going to make like TikTok illegal in America or something or other. And so, if you're China, nuclear weapons, negotiating nuclear weapons caps, which is something the strategic American community really, really wants, right? We don't want the Chinese to build 1,000 missiles and we get into some arms race. It's like 1960s. And so, this might be a way to get the Chinese to agree to that. I would argue that's actually a good thing, right? I would argue that China and the United States engaged in a nuclear arms race would just be disastrous, and we should offer something substantial to the Chinese to sidetrack that, to derail that.
Right, I cannot agree more, Professor Kelly. Well, Biden-Xi summit is actually very closely related to South Korea's diplomacy as well. And so, Professor Im, from South Korea's point of view, some say the Biden-Xi summit is noteworthy in that improvement in bilateral ties could be a great gateway to a Yoon-Xi summit or even a trilateral summit between Seoul, Tokyo, and Beijing. What is your view on this?
Well, in that sense, I also do think this hopefully upcoming, the bilateral summit between the President Biden and the President Xi can be a litmus test, for the further trilateral cooperation among Korea, Japan, and China. Again, for the Korea and Japan, obviously, the China is the #1 trading partner. And for the Korean case, and of course, Japan is deeply directly related to this issue too, but North Korea's nuclear provocations or the threats by the North, and these days, again, as we all know, North is very much close to the Russia, which is very much threatening and which makes the whole situation in this region much more volatile than before. So obviously China's role is, of course, it was already very big, but it's looming larger and larger. So without China's support on their cooperation, it's hard to maintain the stability in this region. So in that sense, I think Tokyo and Seoul do exchange many those discussions, and I think we already got a kind of consensus. So hopefully, again, after the two leaders meet in the San Francisco, again, we can continue all this, cooperative manners with within the regional, those kind of trilateral framework as well. So that's truly what we want to see in the upcoming months.
All right. Well, I hope to see that too, Professor Im. Well, I'd like to ask many more questions to our professors, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Kelly and Professor Im, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.